She sneered at him, her voice dripping with contempt. "Go back to Africa." The crowded bus fell silent. But then, with just a few words, he shattered her arrogance, leaving the entire bus stunned. The bus was packed, filled with the usual morning rush. Office workers clutching their coffee cups, students staring at their phones, elderly passengers sitting quietly, lost in thought. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the mix of faces, each lost in their own world. Among them sat David Carter, a tall black man in his late 30s, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and jeans. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed outside the window as the city blurred past. David wasn't a man who sought attention. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried a quiet authority, though most people on that bus didn't notice. To them, he was just another commuter, another face in the crowd. But one person did notice, an older woman, sitting just a few seats away. Margaret Winston, in her late 50s, with neatly styled silver hair and a purse clutched tightly in her lap. She had the air of someone who believed the world should bend to her expectations. Her eyes flickered toward David with thinly veiled irritation. The bus jolted as it came to a stop. A few passengers shuffled in, but Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Her lips pursed as she let out an exasperated sigh, loud enough for those nearby to hear. It was the kind of sigh that demanded attention, a deliberate display of annoyance. David, sensing the shift in energy, didn't react. He had felt this kind of tension before. It was familiar, expected. A younger woman sitting nearby, Emily, subtly glanced between David and Margaret, picking up on the unspoken hostility. She frowned slightly but said nothing. No one ever did. And then it happened. Margaret turned her body slightly, facing David more directly. Her voice, laced with the kind of disdain that had been sharpened over decades, cut through the quiet hum of the bus. "People like you should go back to Africa." The words landed like a slap against the still air. The reaction was immediate, though no one spoke. The rustling of newspapers stopped. A man who had been scrolling on his phone suddenly froze. A mother, sitting with her young child, glanced up with widened eyes. The air on the bus changed. David finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Margaret's. His expression remained unreadable, his face calm, almost too calm. Emily's fingers clenched around the strap of her bag. She wanted to say something, to step in, but like everyone else, she hesitated. Margaret, emboldened by the silence, let out a short, triumphant huff, as if she had said something clever. But there was something off. David wasn't reacting the way she had expected. He wasn't angry, wasn't flustered. Instead, there was something unsettling in the way he was looking at her. And then, just for a brief second, Margaret caught something in his expression. It was subtle, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Recognition, amusement, pity. Whatever it was, it made her shift uncomfortably. David exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly, as if he had heard this too many times before. And then, finally, he spoke. "You really think I don't belong here?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was something underneath, something heavier. Margaret's smirk faltered. The bus remained silent, and in that moment, as the sunlight caught David's face just right, someone in the crowd, perhaps Emily, perhaps the old man sitting at the back, realized something. This wasn't just another argument. Something was about to happen. Margaret's smirk lingered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had expected an outburst, maybe even an argument, anything that would justify the venom in her words. But David didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, he just sat there, calm, unreadable, studying her like she was nothing more than a mildly interesting puzzle. The silence stretched too long. It made Margaret uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not after making such a bold statement. So she doubled down. I said, "People like you should go back to Africa." Her voice was louder now, cutting through the quiet murmur of the bus. A few passengers flinched, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was suffocating. David still didn't react the way she wanted. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "People like me?" His voice was smooth, deliberate, carrying the weight of something unseen. Margaret scoffed. "You know exactly what I mean." A few seats away, an older man lowered his newspaper. A teenage boy, who had been mindlessly scrolling through his phone, suddenly found himself staring at the unfolding confrontation. David finally moved. He straightened in his seat, stretching his arms slightly, as if getting comfortable. Then he turned, fully facing Margaret for the first time. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Margaret looked uneasy. "You're right," he said, nodding slowly. "Maybe I should go back to Africa." A murmur rippled through the bus. Even Margaret wasn't expecting that response. But let's talk about that for a second. His tone remained conversational, almost too casual for the moment. He gestured toward the window, as if speaking about something as mundane as the weather. "Let's say I get on a plane today, fly across the ocean, step onto African soil. Do you know what happens?" Margaret blinked, unsure of where he was going with this. What?" David's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I'd be a visitor, a tourist, a man from America, because that's what I am. This ? This is my home." Someone near the back exhaled sharply. Emily, the young woman who had been watching in tense silence, leaned forward slightly. Margaret let out a harsh laugh, though it sounded forced. "Oh, please, this isn't your home. Your people came here illegally." David cut her off, his voice still calm, but now carrying a quiet intensity. "My people were brought here in chains." The bus fell completely silent. Even the sound of the road beneath the tires seemed to fade. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she hesitated. David leaned in just a fraction, lowering his voice so that only she, and the now completely captivated passengers, could hear. "We built this country. We bled for it, died for it, fought wars for it. My ancestors didn't have a choice in coming here. But they stayed. They survived. And they built something greater than you could ever understand." Margaret shifted in her seat. Her hands gripped her purse a little tighter. David didn't stop. "So when you say, go back, tell me, where exactly should I go?" His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The teenage boy, who had been watching quietly, suddenly muttered under his breath, "Damn." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The confidence, the smug superiority, gone. Someone snorted from the back, a chuckle. Then, unexpectedly, a slow clap. One person, then another. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Margaret, once so sure of herself, now looked small. David, on the other hand, hadn't moved an inch. But somehow, in the span of a few words, he had taken up more space than anyone else on that bus. Margaret's face tightened. The murmurs around the bus were growing now, passengers exchanging glances, some whispering to each other. The balance of power had shifted in a way she hadn't expected, and she wasn't used to it. She straightened her shoulders, gripping the strap of her purse with both hands, and scoffed. "Oh, give me a break. You people always play the victim." The air turned electric. Even those who had been trying to mind their own business were now fully engaged. David exhaled slowly, as if he had heard this 1,000 times before. Victim? His voice was calm, controlled. Number C, that's where you're wrong. My people didn't just survive. We built, we created, we thrived, despite everything thrown at us. Margaret rolled her eyes, but she shifted in her seat. The first crack in her confidence was starting to show. Oh, please, she said, her voice louder now, as if raising the volume would somehow win the argument. You act like this country owes you something, like you deserve special treatment just because of history. A few passengers tensed. A man near the front let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. Emily, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. That's not what he said. Margaret snapped her head toward her, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Emily swallowed, her fingers tightening around her bag strap, but she didn't back down. He didn't say anything about special treatment. He's talking about facts, and you're twisting it. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. The tension was suffocating now. David turned slightly, looking at Emily, a small nod of acknowledgement. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You think history doesn't matter? His voice was softer now, but somehow it carried more weight than anything else that had been said. You think the past has nothing to do with the present? Margaret let out a forced laugh, but it sounded more like a defense mechanism than genuine amusement. That's exactly what I'm saying. The past is the past. Everyone has struggles. You don't see me crying about what my ancestors went through. David studied her for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet that everyone had to lean in just a little closer, he said, Tell me something, Margaret. What do you think would happen if I told a Jewish person to get over the Holocaust? Margaret's breath hitched. David didn't give her a chance to answer. What if I told an Irish immigrant that their ancestors' struggles didn't matter? Or told a veteran that their sacrifices were just history? Margaret's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. David's voice didn't rise, but it grew sharper, more precise. You wouldn't, would you? Because you know that history matters, that what came before shapes what happens now. But when it comes to black people, suddenly, it's the past is the past. A man sitting near the back, someone who had been silent this whole time, let out a low whistle. Damn. Margaret's fingers curled into her lap. She was losing ground, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she lashed out. Oh, come on. Black people have all the advantages now. Affirmative action, scholarships, government handouts. David let out a short, humorless laugh. Advantages? Margaret's mouth snapped shut. David sat back against his seat, shaking his head. You really believe that, don't you? She crossed her arms. I don't just believe it. It's a fact. David let the words hang in the air. Then, in the same calm, unwavering tone, he said, Do you know what redlining is? Margaret blinked. What? Redlining? David repeated. Do you know what it is? Margaret shifted. Of course No. David cut in. You don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying. Margaret's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. David turned slightly, addressing the bus now. Redlining was a system where black families were deliberately denied housing loans, forced into poor neighborhoods, while white families were given the resources to build generational wealth. It wasn't 200 years ago. It was still happening in the 60s. And the effects? He gestured around. They don't just disappear overnight. A woman near the front, probably in her 60s, nodded faintly. She had seen it happen. Margaret looked uncomfortable now, her face flushed. David continued, his voice even but firm. For decades, black people were shut out of education, jobs, wealth, all while being told to just work harder. And now, when we fight for a seat at the table, you call it special treatment. Margaret's breath was uneven now. David leaned forward again. Tell me something, Margaret. If two runners are in a race, and one has a 300-year head start, do you really think it's fair to say, just run faster? The bus was completely silent. Margaret was breathing hard now, her face red. She opened her mouth, but for the first time in this entire conversation, she had nothing to say. And then, someone started clapping. At first, it was just one, then another, then another. The sound grew, echoing through the bus, drowning out the hum of the engine. Margaret's face burned with humiliation. She stared at David, at the people around her, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. The applause rippled through the bus like a wave, hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. Margaret's face darkened. She glanced around, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But the support she had expected wasn't there. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago was crumbling. David, however, remained seated, unmoved by the clapping. He wasn't here to win applause. He wasn't here to humiliate her. He was here to speak the truth, and he had done exactly that. Margaret scoffed, shaking her head. Oh, so now I'm the villain? Now I'm the bad guy just because I said what everyone else is thinking? David exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. No, Margaret. You're the bad guy because you refuse to see the truth, even when it's right in front of you. She opened her mouth, but before she could fire back, the bus driver's voice cut through the tension. Ma'am, this is your stop. Margaret's head snapped toward the front. She hadn't even realized the bus had pulled up. Outside, the street was bustling with people. She hesitated. Leaving now would mean admitting defeat. Staying would mean enduring the weight of every stare, boring into her. Slowly, she stood up. She clutched her purse, her fingers trembling slightly. As she stepped toward the exit, her eyes darted toward David one last time. She wanted to say something, anything, to reclaim control of the situation. But nothing came. David, on the other hand, simply leaned back in his seat and said, "Have a good day, Margaret." The words were polite, even kind, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Margaret's face twisted, but she said nothing. She turned and stepped off the bus. The doors hissed shut behind her. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, the older man who had been watching from the back finally spoke. Well, that was long overdue. A ripple of quiet laughter followed. The bus lurched forward, the tension slowly melting away. David didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply turned back to the window, watching the city pass by. Emily, still sitting nearby, finally found her voice. "I should have said something sooner." David turned to her, his expression softening. "You did. That's what matters." She looked down, nodding slightly. Then, after a moment, she smiled. The conversation was over. The lesson, however, would linger far beyond this ride. The bus moved forward, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Passengers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, some thoughtful, some uncomfortable. It was as if they had all been part of something larger than just a morning commute. Near the front, an older woman who had been silent the entire time turned to David, her voice quiet but firm. "That was something." David didn't respond right away. He just nodded, as if acknowledging more than just her words. Emily, still sitting nearby, let out a slow breath. "I don't get it," she murmured. more to herself than anyone else. Why do people like her always think they can get away with that? David glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small, almost knowing smile, he said, "Because for a long time, they did." Silence. The words hung in the air, undeniable. A few seats away, the teenage boy who had been quietly observing the entire exchange finally spoke up. "That was badass," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've never seen someone get shut down like that before." David chuckled softly, but there was no pride in his voice, only a quiet understanding. "It's not about shutting someone down," he said. "It's about making sure they can't ignore the truth anymore." The bus hit a red light. Outside, Margaret was still visible on the sidewalk, standing stiffly, her back to the bus. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked back. David didn't watch her. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to her. The doors opened at the next stop. As David stood gathering his things, a man in a suit, one who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke. "That was impressive." David paused, looking at him for a moment before shaking his head. "It shouldn't have to be." With that, he stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind him. The bus moved on, but the people inside, every single one of them, would carry this moment with them long after the ride was over. The bus rolled forward, but the energy inside had shifted. People who had been strangers just minutes ago now shared a silent understanding. Some still stared out the window, lost in thought. Others stole quick glances at the empty seat where Margaret had once sat. Emily tapped her fingers on her bag, her mind still replaying everything. Finally, she looked at the teenage boy across from her and said, "Well, I don't think she'll be saying that again anytime soon." The boy smirked. Not in public, at least. A chuckle rippled through the few passengers still listening. It wasn't amusement. It was acknowledgement. David was gone, but the impact of his words remained. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't raged. He had simply held up a mirror and forced everyone, including Margaret, to see the reflection for what it was. Somewhere in the back, the older man who had spoken earlier sighed, folding up his newspaper. About time someone said it out loud. Emily nodded, then pulled out her phone. People need to hear more stories like this. She wasn't wrong. If more people spoke up, if more people refused to let ignorance go unchallenged, then maybe, just maybe, change wasn't as far away as it seemed. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a moment like this? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe these conversations matter, share this video, subscribe, and let's keep the discussion going.